The wind cut across the frozen border like a blade with no handle, and Elira Voss walked into it without shoes. Her feet had gone numb 3 fields back, somewhere between the burned watchtower and the frozen creek that used to mark friendly land. She did not stop to feel the pain anymore. There was a flag pressed against her chest, torn down the middle, its edges frayed and dark with old blood that had long since dried into the fabric like a stain that refused to be forgotten. It was the flag of an alliance that no longer existed except in the stubborn beat of her heart. Behind her, the smoke from her village still rose into the gray sky. Ahead of her, across an open stretch of ice and dead grass, stood the army of the Alpha King. She could see them now, hundreds of soldiers in dark armor, standing in perfect rows along the ridge, their breath rising in small clouds. At the center of them, on a black horse that did not flinch at the cold, sat a man who did not need a crown to be recognized. Cale Draven, the king who had never lost a war, the king whose name alone made grown men lower their eyes. Elira kept walking. She heard whispers ripple through the soldiers as she came closer, more felt than heard, like a current beneath still water. A lone woman, barefoot, unarmed, carrying a flag that had once meant peace between 2 nations, before that peace was murdered in a single, terrible night. She did not know if she would be killed the moment she crossed the last few steps of frozen ground. She had made peace with that possibility 3 days ago, when she buried the last of her family with her own hands. What she did not expect was for the king to move. He came off his horse without a word, without a single command to his men, and started walking toward her across the ice. A murmur spread through his soldiers, quick and confused, because Cale Draven did not walk toward strangers. He did not walk toward anyone. People walked toward him, and they did so carefully, the way one might approach a wolf that had not yet decided if it was hungry. But he walked, steady, unhurried. His dark coat moved with the wind, and his eyes, sharp and pale as winter light, stayed fixed on her the entire way. Elira stopped when there were perhaps 10 paces between them. Her legs were shaking now, not from fear, but from the cold that had finally caught up to her body. She lifted the flag with both hands, holding it out as if it were an offering, or perhaps a shield, though it could stop nothing. "I am Elira Voss," she said, and her voice did not break, even though everything else in her wanted to. "Daughter of Halden Voss, who died trying to protect the alliance your people and mine once shared. I did not come to fight you. I came because there is no one left in my village to send instead." Silence. She had expected shouting. She had expected a blade, or an order, or at the very least, contempt. She had rehearsed a dozen different endings to this moment during her long walk across the ice, and none of them included the king simply staring at her the way he was now, as though she were something he had lost a long time ago and never expected to see again. His jaw tightened. His hands, she noticed, were clenched at his sides. "Say that again," he said. His voice was low, rough, like something dragged over stone. "I said I came because there was no one left to send in my place." "No," he said. "Your name." "Elira Voss." Something shifted behind his eyes, something she could not name, something that looked almost like pain, and then, for reasons she would not understand until much later, the great Alpha King, who had burned villages and broken kingdoms, and never once been known to hesitate, went completely silent. He did not speak again, not when his general, a broad man named Edric, jogged up beside him and asked in a hushed voice if they should take her as a prisoner. Not when Elira's knees finally buckled from the cold, and 2 soldiers rushed forward to catch her before she hit the ice. He simply watched, his expression unreadable, as they lifted her and turned to carry her toward the fortress that loomed dark and enormous in the distance. It was Edric who finally spoke on the king's behalf, since the king seemed to have lost the ability. "Bring her inside," Edric said, glancing uncertainly at Cale. "Warm quarters, not the cells." The soldiers hesitated. Prisoners from the enemy border were never given warm quarters, but no one questioned an order that came, however strangely, from the king's own silence, and the small, sharp nod he gave in response. As they carried her away, Elira caught one last glimpse of him standing alone on the ice, the wind pulling at his coat, staring after her, as though the ground itself had shifted beneath his feet. She did not understand what she had done to cause that reaction. She only knew that she was still alive, when every version of this morning she had imagined ended with her dead in the snow beside her father's flag. The fortress of the Alpha King rose out of the frozen hills like something carved by the mountain itself, rather than built by human hands. Its walls were black stone, its towers sharp as claws against the sky, and the moment Alira was carried through its gates, she felt the weight of 1,000 watching eyes, though she saw only a handful of guards along the walls. They brought her to a chamber far grander than anything she had slept in since her childhood, before the war had taken her family's estate and reduced her world to a single small house on the border. A fire crackled in a wide stone hearth. Blankets thick enough to smother a person waited on a bed twice the size she needed. A servant, a young woman with kind eyes and quick hands, helped peel the frozen fabric from Alira's feet and wrapped them gently in warm cloth soaked in something that smelled faintly of mint and burned just enough to prove her feet still worked. "You're lucky," the servant murmured, not looking up from her work. "Another hour out there, and you'd have lost your toes, maybe more." "I didn't have another hour to spare," Alira said quietly. The servant glanced up at that, something like sympathy flickering across her face before she caught herself and returned her focus to the bandages. Alira understood. No one spoke too freely inside these walls, not when the person they served could apparently silence an army with nothing but a fixed stare. She did not sleep that night, despite the exhaustion pressing down on every part of her body. She sat by the fire instead, the broken flag draped over her knees, running her fingers along the tear in the fabric where the two halves no longer met. Her father had died holding this flag. He had believed, foolishly perhaps, that the alliance between their village and the Alpha King's territory could survive the betrayal that split it apart. He had ridden out alone to try to stop the bloodshed, and he had never ridden back. Alira had buried an empty grave in his honor, because his body was never returned. She thought of Cale Draven's face on the ice, the way his composure had cracked the instant she said her name, and she wondered, not for the first time, whether there was a story behind that reaction that she did not yet know. A story that might explain why a king known for cruelty had ordered warm blankets instead of chains. She did not have long to wonder before the door to her chamber opened without a knock. Cale Draven stood in the doorway, still wearing the same dark coat from the ice, though someone had draped a cloak of deep red over his shoulders since then. He looked at her for a long moment, and Alira lifted her chin, refusing to let him see how much his silence during their first meeting had unsettled her. "You could have killed me," she said, before he could speak first. "Out on the ice. It would have ended the matter quickly. Instead, you brought me here and gave me blankets. Would you have preferred the cells?" His voice, at least, worked properly now, low and even, carrying none of the roughness from earlier. "I would have preferred an explanation." Something flickered across his face, a shadow of the same unreadable expression from the ice. He stepped further into the room, but kept a careful distance between them, as though he did not entirely trust himself to come closer. "Your father," he said finally, "Halden Voss. Tell me about him." Alira's throat tightened, but she forced the words out steady and clear. "He was the chieftain of the border villages. He believed the alliance between his people and yours could last, even after everything that happened. He rode out during the worst of the fighting to try to broker peace between your commanders and ours. He never came back. No body was returned. No message was sent explaining why." Cale's jaw tightened again, the muscle jumping beneath the skin. "I did not order his death." "That is not the same as saying you know how he died." "No," Cale admitted, quiet. "It is not." Alira studied him, searching his face for the lie she expected to find there, the practiced deception of a king trying to soothe an enemy into compliance. She found none. What she found instead was something far more unsettling, a genuine, weighted grief, as though her father's death had cost him something personal, something he had not yet allowed himself to grieve properly. "Why did you go silent?" she asked, "when I said my name?" For a long moment, she thought he would not answer. The fire popped and crackled between them, throwing shifting light across his sharp features, and outside the wind continued its endless howl against the fortress walls. "Because I have heard that name before," he said finally, "in a place I did not expect to hear it again." "Where?" He did not answer that. Instead, he crossed the room in 3 long strides and knelt in front of her chair, close enough now that she could see the exhaustion carved into the lines around his eyes, the weight of years he seemed to be carrying that had nothing to do with the cold outside. You walked across the border alone, he said, carrying a broken flag, expecting to die. Why? Because someone had to try to end this, Alira said. My village is gone. My people are starving in the hills, hiding from raiding parties on both sides, who no longer remember what they're fighting for. I have nothing left to lose, Your Majesty, which makes me either the bravest person to walk onto this ice, or the most desperate. I suspect it is both. Kale was quiet for a long moment, studying her face, as though searching for something specific, some detail he needed to confirm, before he could believe what he was seeing. Rest, he said finally, standing and stepping back toward the door. No harm will come to you within these walls. You have my word. The word of the Alpha King, Alira said softly, is not something my people have learned to trust. He paused at the door, his back to her, his shoulders tense beneath the red cloak. Then let me be the first reason they learn otherwise. He left without another word, and Alira sat alone by the fire for a long time afterward, turning his strange behavior over in her mind like a puzzle with missing pieces. She did not sleep that night. She could not stop thinking about the way his voice had cracked when he said her father's name, or the grief buried behind his pale eyes, or the impossible, dangerous question that had begun to take root in her chest. What if the Alpha King was not the monster she had been raised to fear? And what if that question mattered more than she was ready to admit? Morning arrived pale and thin through the narrow window of her chamber, and Alira woke to the sound of raised voices somewhere beyond her door. She rose carefully, testing her bandaged feet against the cold stone floor, and moved close enough to listen without being seen. You cannot keep her here, a voice was saying, sharp with frustration. She recognized it as Edric's, the general from the ice. The council will demand answers. A border woman inside the fortress, treated like a guest instead of a captive. It sends a message we cannot afford to send. The council will have their answers when I am ready to give them, Kale's voice replied, calm but final in a way that ended arguments. Your Majesty, with respect, the men saw what happened on that field. They saw you go silent in front of an entire army. If word of that reaches the wrong ears, then it reaches them, Kale said. I am not asking for your approval, Edric. I am informing you of what will happen. She stays. She is not to be harmed. That is all you need to know for now. There was a long pause, and then Edric's voice again, quieter this time, almost gentle. You know what this looks like. After everything with your bloodline, after the stories the old ones tell. Silence stretched long enough that Alira held her breath without meaning to. I know exactly what it looks like, Kale finally said. That is precisely why she stays. Footsteps retreated down the corridor, and Alira stepped back from the door, before anyone could catch her listening. She sat back down by the dying fire, her mind spinning with everything she had just heard. Stories, bloodline. Whatever secret Kale Draven was carrying, it was clearly larger than a single border skirmish, larger than the broken flag still resting across her lap. She was still turning the words over in her mind when the door opened again, and this time it was not Kale who entered, but an older woman dressed in deep blue robes, her silver hair pulled back in a severe braid, her eyes sharp with an intelligence that made Alira instantly cautious. You're awake, the woman said, closing the door behind her. Good. We don't have much time before he returns, and there are things you deserve to know before he decides how much of the truth to give you himself. Who are you? My name is Nora, the woman said, settling into the chair across from Alira, with the ease of someone who had done this many times before. I served this family since before Kale was old enough to hold a sword. I was there the night his mother died. I was there when the prophecy was first spoken over his cradle, and I have watched him carry its weight every single day since. Alira's pulse quickened. What prophecy? Nora's expression softened, though her eyes remained watchful. That the war between the border villages in this kingdom would only end when a daughter of that border carried the broken flag across the frozen line, and the Alpha King recognized her as the one meant to stand beside him. His silence on that field yesterday was not confusion, child. It was recognition. The fire popped softly in the hearth, and Alira sat very still, the weight of Nora's words settling over her like a second, heavier blanket. That's impossible, she whispered. Perhaps, Nora said. Or perhaps it is simply inconvenient, which is a very different thing from impossible. Outside, the wind continued to howl against the fortress walls, carrying with it the distant echo of two armies, still waiting, still watching, still uncertain whether the fragile silence between them would hold or shatter before the sun set again. Nora left as quietly as she had entered, slipping out through the heavy door with a final warning that Cale must never learn how much she had revealed, at least not yet. Illyra sat alone with the fire dying to embers, the word prophecy circling through her thoughts like a hawk that refused to land. She did not want to believe it. Believing it meant accepting that her presence in this fortress was not an accident of desperation, but something written long before she was born, something neither she nor Cale had ever been given the choice to refuse. She was still awake when dawn broke fully over the frozen hills, and a servant arrived carrying a simple gray dress, warm stockings, and boots lined with fur. Illyra dressed slowly, testing her healing feet against the floor, grateful the numbness had faded into something closer to soreness. When she finally stepped into the corridor outside her chamber, she found Cale waiting for her, leaning against the stone wall with his arms crossed, looking as though he had not slept at all. "You look like a man who has an army to command, and no time to stand around waiting for me," she said. "I have both," Cale replied, "and yet here I am." He led her through corridors lined with old banners and dark portraits of ancestors, whose eyes seemed to follow her as she passed. The fortress was larger than she had realized the night before, its halls branching in every direction, its walls thick enough to muffle the wind entirely. Guards nodded stiffly as they passed, their eyes flicking between their king and the border woman at his side with poorly hidden curiosity. "Your general does not approve of me," Illyra said, remembering the argument she had overheard. "Edric does not approve of most things that complicate his plans," Cale said. "He is a good soldier, a cautious man. He believes peace is a weakness disguised as a virtue." "And what do you believe?" Cale did not answer right away. He led her instead through a set of tall doors, into a wide hall lined with windows, overlooking the frozen valley below, where she could see, in the far distance, the smoke still rising faintly from what remained of her village. "I believe," he said finally, "that peace is the hardest thing a person can fight for, because unlike war, it requires you to trust the very people you have been taught to hate." Illyra turned to look at him properly then, studying the sharp lines of his face, the pale eyes that seemed to carry both exhaustion and something gentler beneath it. "That is not what I expected the Alpha King to say. Most people expect very little of me beyond cruelty," Cale said, a faint, tired smile touching his mouth. "It is easier that way. Easier to rule, easier to be feared than questioned." "And is that what you want, to be feared?" "I want the killing to stop," he said quietly, his gaze drifting toward the smoke on the horizon. "I have wanted that for longer than you would believe, Illyra Voss. But wanting a thing and being able to achieve it are very different burdens to carry." She did not know how to respond to that, so she said nothing, and for a long moment they simply stood together at the window, watching the distant smoke curl into the pale morning sky. It was Edric who eventually interrupted them, striding into the hall with a stack of parchment under one arm, and an expression that suggested the morning had already gone poorly before it truly began. "Your Majesty," he said, bowing stiffly, though his eyes cut toward Illyra with obvious suspicion. "The council has requested an audience. Word of yesterday's events has already reached them." Cale's jaw tightened, but he nodded once. "Tell them I will attend within the hour." "They have also requested," Edric continued, choosing his words carefully, "that the border woman be present." Illyra's stomach tightened at that. "Why would your council want to see me?" "Because," Edric said, his tone clipped, "half of them believe you are a spy, sent to weaken the king's resolve, and the other half have already heard whispers of the prophecy, and believe you are the fulfillment of it. Either way, they intend to decide for themselves which is true." Cale's expression darkened, and for a moment, Illyra thought he might refuse outright. Instead, he turned to her, his pale eyes searching her face, as though asking permission rather than issuing a command. "You do not have to go," he said. "I can face them alone." "No," Illyra said, surprising herself with how steady her voice sounded. "If they intend to decide my fate, I would rather be present to speak for myself than let them build a version of me out of rumors and fear." Something like respect flickered across Cale's face, quickly hidden but not quickly enough. "Then we go together." The council chamber was a cold, circular room, deep within the fortress, its walls lined with tall windows that let in more light than warmth. A dozen men and women sat around a curved table of dark wood, their expressions ranging from open hostility to careful, calculating curiosity. Alira felt every set of eyes settle on her the moment she stepped through the doors beside Kale, and she forced herself to walk with her chin lifted, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing her flinch. An older man near the center of the table rose first, his silver beard trimmed sharp, his eyes cold as the ice outside. "Your Majesty," he said, his voice carrying easily across the chamber. "We have heard troubling reports. That you walked unarmed toward an enemy woman. That you brought her inside these walls and granted her comforts reserved for allies, not captives. The council has concerns." "The council's concerns are noted, Lord Varric," Kale replied evenly. "This is Alira Voss, daughter of Halden Voss, who died attempting to preserve the alliance between our people and hers. She came unarmed, carrying the flag her father died defending, seeking an end to this war. I saw no reason to answer that with violence." Murmurs rippled around the table. A woman near the far end, younger than the others, leaned forward with sharp interest. "The prophecy speaks of a daughter of the border, carrying the broken flag across the frozen line. Is this council meant to believe such an event occurred purely by coincidence?" Kale's expression did not change, though Alira felt the tension in his shoulders beside her. "I am not here to discuss prophecy, Lady Mirren. I am here to discuss the possibility of ending a war that has cost both our peoples more than any of us can afford to keep losing." Lord Varric's eyes narrowed. "And what does the border woman say of this? Does she come seeking peace, or does she come seeking a crown?" The insult landed exactly where it was meant to, and Alira felt heat rise in her chest, though she kept her voice level when she spoke. "I came seeking neither, Lord Varric. I came because my village is gone, my father is dead, and the people who remain are hiding in the hills with nothing left to eat, and no one left to protect them. I do not care about crowns or prophecies. I care about ending the deaths of people who never wanted this war in the first place." Silence fell over the chamber, broken only by the wind pressing faintly against the tall windows. Lord Varric studied her for a long moment, something unreadable shifting behind his cold eyes, before he finally sat back down without another word. It was Lady Mirren who spoke next, her voice softer but no less pointed. "Whatever her intentions, Your Majesty, the council cannot ignore what the soldiers witnessed on that field. Your silence, your reaction to her name. If the old stories are true, this is no longer a matter you can resolve quietly behind these walls." Kale's hands tightened at his sides, though his face remained carefully composed. "The old stories," he said slowly, "have been used to justify wars long before I was born. I will not allow them to be used to justify continuing one now." "And if the stories are simply true," Lady Mirren pressed, "what then, Your Majesty?" Kale did not answer immediately. When he finally spoke, his gaze shifted briefly toward Alira, something unreadable and heavy passing between them, before he turned back to the council. "Then I suppose," he said quietly, "we will find out together what that truth requires of us." The meeting ended without resolution. The council dismissed, with instructions to gather again, once Kale had time to consider their concerns properly. As they walked back through the corridors afterward, Alira could feel the weight of everything that had just been said pressing down on her chest. "They hate me," she said quietly. "They fear what they do not understand," Kale corrected. "There is a difference, even if it does not always feel like one." "And you? Do you fear it too?" Kale stopped walking, turning to face her fully in the dim corridor, the torchlight flickering shadows across his sharp features. "I have spent my entire life being told that my fate was already written before I ever had the chance to choose it," he said. "I do not know yet whether I fear that, or whether I am simply tired of fighting against something I may never be able to change." Alira held his gaze, searching for the lie she still half expected to find, and finding instead only the same raw honesty that had unsettled her from the very first moment on the ice. "Then let us find out together," she said, echoing his own words back to him, "whatever the truth requires." Something shifted in his expression then, something quiet and fragile that looked almost like hope, though neither of them dared to name it aloud. Outside, the wind continued its endless howl against the fortress walls, and somewhere beyond the frozen hills, two armies waited, still uncertain whether the silence between their leaders would hold long enough to matter. That night, Illyra dreamed of fire. She woke gasping, the blankets tangled around her legs, her heart pounding, as though she had truly been running through burning fields instead of simply lying asleep in a warm chamber. The dream had shown her the night her village fell, the flames climbing the wooden walls of her childhood home, her father's voice calling her name through the smoke. It was not the first time the memory had returned to haunt her sleep, but something about it felt sharper tonight, more detailed than usual, as though the fortress walls themselves were drawing old grief closer to the surface. She rose and wrapped a blanket around her shoulders, moving to the window to watch the moonlight spill silver across the frozen valley below. It was there, staring out at the quiet night, that she began to piece together the fragments of her father's final days, memories she had buried so deep she had almost convinced herself they did not matter anymore. Her father had not simply ridden out to broker peace on a whim. He had received a letter first, delivered by a rider she did not recognize, and he had read it alone in his study, for the better part of an hour, before emerging with his jaw set and his decision already made. Illyra had been young then, barely old enough to understand the weight of what was happening, but she remembered the way her mother had begged him not to go, and the way he had simply kissed her forehead and said that some things were worth more than his own safety. She had never seen that letter again. She had assumed, in the chaos that followed his disappearance, that it had been lost along with everything else her family once owned. But now, standing in the quiet dark of the Alpha King's fortress, she found herself wondering if that letter had ever truly been lost at all, or if someone had simply made certain it disappeared. The thought unsettled her enough that she could not return to sleep. She dressed quietly and slipped out into the corridor, following the dim torchlight toward the fortress library she had glimpsed briefly during her walk with Kale the day before. She was not entirely certain what she hoped to find there, only that sitting alone with her thoughts had become unbearable, and movement felt like the only cure. The library was larger than she expected, shelves rising 2 stories high, filled with books and scrolls that smelled of dust and old leather. A single lamp burned near a reading table at the far end, and it was there that she found Nora, sitting alone with several old volumes spread open before her. "You're awake late," Nora said, not looking up from the page she was studying. "I could say the same of you." Nora finally lifted her gaze, her sharp eyes studying Illyra, with an expression that suggested she had been expecting this visit for some time. "Sit," she said, gesturing to the chair across from her. "I imagine you have questions that have been keeping you from sleep." Illyra sat, pulling her blanket tighter around her shoulders. "My father received a letter before he rode out to try to stop the war. I never saw its contents. I always assumed it was lost when our home was burned. But I keep wondering now if that assumption was wrong." Nora's expression grew careful, the kind of carefulness that told Illyra she had struck closer to the truth than she realized. "What makes you ask that now, of all times?" "Because everything about this feels too deliberate to be an accident," Illyra said. "The prophecy, my father's death, the timing of my arrival here. None of it feels like chance, and I would rather understand the truth than continue stumbling through it blind." Nora closed the book in front of her with a soft, final sound, folding her hands atop the worn cover. "Your father's letter," she said slowly, "was sent by someone within these very walls, someone who wanted the fighting to end as badly as he did, and who believed your father was the only man with enough influence over the border villages to help make that happen." Illyra's breath caught. "Who?" "Kale's mother," Nora said quietly. "The old queen. She was dying even then, though few knew it at the time, and she spent her final months trying desperately to undo the damage caused by the betrayal that shattered the alliance in the first place. She believed your father could help her son avoid inheriting a war neither of them had started. Then why did he die?" Illyra's voice cracked despite her effort to keep it steady. "If she wanted peace, why did my father end up dead instead of successful?" Nora's expression turned heavy with old grief. "Because someone intercepted him before he ever reached the negotiation. Someone who did not want peace, because peace would have cost them everything they had built through the continuation of this war." "Who," Illyra demanded, leaning forward, "would want a war to continue badly enough to murder a man trying to end it?" Nora hesitated, glancing toward the library doors, as though worried they might not be alone. "There are men within this fortress, and within your own border villages as well, who have profited greatly from this conflict. Weapons traders, smugglers, men who move goods and coin through the chaos of war in ways that would never be possible during peace. Your father's death was not born from hatred between our peoples, Alira. It was born from greed, dressed up in the language of loyalty. Alira sat back, the weight of the revelation settling over her like ice water. All these years, she had believed her father died a martyr to an old, tired hatred between two nations. The truth, it seemed, was far uglier and far more mundane. He had died because someone valued profit over peace, and had been willing to kill to protect it. "Does Kale know this?" she asked finally. "He suspects," Nora said. "He has suspected for some time that certain figures within his own council have been quietly working against every attempt at peace he has tried to pursue. But suspicion is not proof, and accusing powerful men without evidence is a dangerous game, even for a king." "Then we need proof," Alira said, her voice hardening with new resolve. "If someone within these walls murdered my father to keep this war alive, I intend to see them exposed." Nora studied her for a long moment, something like approval flickering behind her sharp eyes. "You sound like your father," she said quietly. "He spoke with that same fire, the last time I saw him alive. You knew him." "I met him once," Nora admitted, "when he came to deliver his answer to the old queen's letter in person, rather than risk sending a written reply that could be intercepted. He was a good man, Alira, brave and stubborn, and utterly convinced that peace was worth any risk. I believe you carry more of him inside you than you realize." Alira sat with that for a long moment, watching the lamp flicker between them, feeling the weight of her father's memory settle differently now, no longer simply grief but something closer to purpose. If someone had killed him to protect their own greed, then finishing what he started was no longer only about ending a war. It was about honoring the truth he had died trying to defend. "I need to speak with Kale," she said finally, rising from her chair. "He deserves to know what you've told me." Nora nodded, though her expression remained cautious. "Be careful how you approach this, Alira. If there truly are men within this fortress willing to kill to protect their profits, exposing them recklessly could put both you and the king in far greater danger than either of you currently understand." Alira found Kale in the fortress courtyard the following morning, standing alone near the training yards, watching a group of young soldiers practice their drills in the pale winter light. He looked tired, in a way that had nothing to do with sleep, his shoulders carrying a weight she was only beginning to understand. "I spoke with Nora last night," she said, coming to stand beside him. Kale's expression shifted, something guarded entering his pale eyes. "What did she tell you?" "That my father received a letter from your mother before he rode out to broker peace. That someone intercepted him before he could reach the negotiation. That there are men profiting from this war who would rather see it continue than allow it to end." Kale was quiet for a long moment, his jaw tight, his gaze fixed on the soldiers training in the distance. "I have suspected as much for years," he admitted finally. "My mother spent her final months trying to undo the damage of the betrayal that started this war. She believed peace was still possible, if only she could find the right allies to help her achieve it. When your father died, she never fully recovered from the loss. I believe it hastened her own death, in the end." "Then help me find proof," Alira said. "Help me expose whoever is responsible, so that neither my father's death nor your mother's efforts were wasted for nothing." Kale turned to face her fully, something fierce and determined settling into his expression, the exhaustion in his eyes replaced, if only briefly, by something closer to hope. "If we do this," he said, "it will not be simple. It will mean confronting men who have spent years building power through this war, men who will not surrender that power without a fight." "I did not walk barefoot across a frozen border because I was afraid of a fight," Alira said. "I did it because I believed peace was worth the risk. I still believe that." Something shifted in Kale's expression then, warm and unguarded, in a way she had not seen from him before. "Then we begin together," he said quietly, "whatever it costs us." Behind them, the young soldiers continued their drills in the pale winter light, unaware that the fate of their entire war had just quietly shifted course within a few feet of where they trained. Word of the king's private meetings with the border woman spread through the fortress faster than either of them anticipated. By the time Alira crossed the courtyard toward the eastern hall 2 days later, she had already caught more than one guard whispering behind gloved hands, more than one servant falling silent the moment she passed. She had grown used to suspicion during her years on the border, but the particular flavor of it inside these walls carried an edge she had not expected, something colder and more calculated than simple distrust of an outsider. She found the source of that edge waiting for her outside the eastern hall, a tall man with dark hair and a scar running along his jaw, dressed in the fine, dark clothing of a merchant rather than a soldier. He introduced himself as Victor Ashby, a name she did not recognize, though something about the careful, practiced friendliness in his smile made her instinctively wary. "Lady Voss," he said, bowing slightly, though his eyes did not carry the same warmth as his voice. "I have heard a great deal about you these past few days. The whole fortress speaks of little else." "I am not a lady," Elira said carefully. "Simply a border woman, trying to survive a war I did not start." "Modest," Victor said, his smile widening. "Though I imagine modesty will serve you well here, given how quickly opinions can shift within these walls. May I offer you some advice, from a man who has spent many years navigating the currents of this court?" Elira said nothing, waiting. "Trust is a fragile thing here," Victor continued, his voice dropping lower, as though sharing a secret meant only for her ears. "The king's affections, however genuine they may seem, have shifted before. It would be wise not to build your hopes too high on the foundation of a single strange moment on a frozen field." "Is that concern for my well-being?" Elira asked evenly, "or a warning meant to discourage me from something else entirely?" Victor's smile did not waver, though something sharper flickered briefly behind his eyes. "Simply the advice of a man who has watched this court far longer than you have. Take it as you wish." He bowed again, and departed before she could press further, leaving her standing alone in the corridor, with an unpleasant knot forming in her stomach. She did not know who Victor Ashby was, or what role he played within the fortress, but something about the encounter felt deliberate, as though he had been sent specifically to plant doubt in her mind, rather than simply offer friendly counsel. She mentioned the encounter to Cale that evening, finding him in his private study surrounded by maps and reports, his expression tightening the moment she described the merchant's careful warning. "Victor Ashby," Cale repeated, setting down the report he had been reading. "He supplies grain and iron to half the garrisons along our southern border. He has grown remarkably wealthy during this war, wealthy enough that his influence within the council has grown alongside his coin. Do you trust him?" "I have never had reason to distrust him," Cale admitted, "though I confess I have also never had reason to look closely at where his wealth truly comes from. Perhaps it is time that changed." Over the following days, Elira and Cale worked quietly together, poring over old shipping records and supply manifests that Nora helped smuggle out of the fortress archives without drawing attention. It was slow, careful work, made more difficult by the need for secrecy, since neither of them knew how many eyes and ears throughout the fortress might report their efforts back to whoever did not wish this war to end. The pattern, when it finally emerged, was subtle but damning. Grain shipments meant for border villages consistently vanished before reaching their destination, only to reappear weeks later sold at inflated prices to garrisons desperate enough to pay whatever was demanded. Iron meant for defensive fortifications was diverted instead toward weapons manufacturing, weapons that were then sold, at considerable profit, to both sides of the ongoing conflict. Every thread led back, eventually, to accounts connected loosely, but unmistakably to Victor Ashby. "He has been selling weapons to both armies," Elira said one evening, staring at the evidence spread across Cale's study table, disbelief and anger warring in her chest. "He does not care who wins this war, because either outcome fills his pockets." "Worse than that," Cale said grimly, tracing a line of numbers with his finger. "Look at the dates. Several of these shipments correspond directly with moments when peace negotiations were attempted and failed. Every time an opportunity for ending this war arose, a conveniently timed attack or betrayal occurred shortly after, reigniting the fighting exactly when it threatened to stop." Elira's breath caught. He has been sabotaging peace deliberately, not simply profiting from war, but actively ensuring it continues. "And if that is true," Cale said quietly, "then it is entirely possible he played some role in your father's death as well." A peace negotiation successfully completed would have ended his profits overnight. The realization settled over Elira like a physical weight, cold and heavy in her chest. She had spent years believing her father died a victim of old hatred between two stubborn nations, Instead, it appeared increasingly likely that he had died because a single greedy man could not tolerate the loss of profit that peace would have brought. "We need more proof before we can move against him," Cale said, seeing the fury building behind her eyes. "Victor has allies within the council, men who would protect him fiercely if we accused him without solid evidence. We move carefully, or we do not move at all." "How much more proof do you need?" Elara demanded. "The pattern is clear. The dates align. What else could you possibly require?" "A confession," Cale said, "or evidence so undeniable that even his allies cannot argue against it. I understand your anger, Elara. Truly, I do. But acting recklessly now could destroy every chance we have of exposing him properly, and it could put both our lives at greater risk than either of us currently understands." Elara forced herself to breathe, to let the fury settle into something colder and more useful. "Then we find that proof," she said. "Whatever it takes." It was Nora, several nights later, who brought them the breakthrough they needed. She arrived at Cale's study long after the rest of the fortress had gone quiet, her expression carrying an urgency that immediately set both Elara and Cale on edge. "One of the archive clerks came to me tonight," Nora said, closing the study door firmly behind her. "A young man named Simon. He has worked in the records hall for years, quietly filing away shipment manifests without ever questioning their contents. Tonight, he finally worked up the courage to admit he has long suspected something was wrong with the numbers he processes." "What did he tell you?" Cale asked. "He kept copies," Nora said, producing a small bundle of parchment from beneath her cloak. "Original shipment orders, before they were altered to hide the true destination of certain goods. He was afraid to come forward alone, certain no one would believe a lowly clerk over a wealthy merchant with friends in the council. But he trusted me enough to hand these over, once I promised him protection." Cale took the parchment carefully, unfolding it beneath the lamplight, his expression growing darker with every line he read. Elara leaned closer, and together they found, written in Victor Ashby's own recognizable hand, orders diverting grain and weapons away from their intended destinations, along with instructions to falsify the official records afterward to hide the theft. "This is enough," Cale said finally, his voice tight, with barely controlled anger. "This is proof no council member could reasonably dispute." "There is more," Nora said quietly. "Simon mentioned one additional detail I believe you need to hear before you act. He said that several months before your father's death, Elara, Victor Ashby personally requested a meeting with him. He offered Simon a substantial bribe to permanently misplace a particular travel manifest, one belonging to a border chieftain traveling under royal invitation." Elira's blood went cold. "My father's manifest. Simon refused the bribe at the time," Nora continued. "He did not understand the significance of the request until years later, once whispers began circulating about how the peace negotiation had failed so suddenly and so violently. He has carried the guilt of that refusal, and the guilt of staying silent afterward, for a very long time." Cale set the parchment down slowly, his jaw tight, his pale eyes burning with a cold, controlled fury that Elara had not seen from him before. "Victor Ashby did not simply profit from this war," he said quietly. "He orchestrated your father's death to protect that profit. We have him now, Elara. Whatever protection his allies believe they can offer, this evidence will burn straight through it." Elara stared at the parchment on the table, the proof of her father's murder finally laid bare after years of unanswered grief, and felt something settle inside her chest that was not quite relief, but something close enough to it that her hands finally stopped shaking. "Then let us finish what he started," she said quietly. "Let us finish what my father died trying to achieve." They agreed to move carefully, gathering additional testimony from Simon, and cross-referencing the falsified manifests against records held in neighboring garrisons, before presenting anything formally to the council. Cale insisted on this caution, reminding Elara that Victor Ashby had survived and thrived within this court for years, precisely because he understood how to protect himself against accusations that lacked overwhelming proof. It was a decision that very nearly cost them everything. The attack came 3 nights later, while Elara was walking back from the archive hall alone, having stayed late to help Simon organize the remaining evidence they intended to present. The corridor was quiet, lit only by scattered torches along the stone walls, and she noticed the figure emerging from the shadows, only a heartbeat before he lunged toward her, a blade catching the torchlight in a brief, terrible flash. She reacted on instinct, twisting away from the strike and stumbling hard against the wall, pain blooming along her shoulder, where the blade caught fabric and skin alike. She opened her mouth to scream, but the man was already closing the distance again, his face hidden beneath a dark hood, his movements precise and practiced in a way that told her this was not his first attempt at violence. She fought back the only way she knew how, kicking hard at his knee and scrambling backward across the stone floor, shouting now with everything her lungs could manage. The sound echoed down the empty corridor, and for one terrifying moment she believed no one would hear it in time. Then Cale was there. He came around the corner at a dead run, and whatever calm, careful composure he usually carried was gone entirely, replaced by something fierce and immediate that sent the attacker stumbling backward in surprise. Cale did not hesitate. He closed the distance in seconds, disarming the man with brutal efficiency and pinning him against the stone wall hard enough that the blade clattered uselessly to the floor between them. "Who sent you?" Cale demanded, his voice a low, dangerous growl that Alira had never heard from him before. The man said nothing, his eyes wide with fear beneath his hood, and Cale's grip tightened, until the man finally gasped out a single name between labored breaths. "Ashby. Victor Ashby sent me." Guards arrived moments later, drawn by the commotion, and the attacker was hauled away for questioning, while Cale turned immediately to Alira, his hands gentle now as he checked the wound along her shoulder, his expression carrying a fear she had not expected to see from him. "You're hurt," he said, his voice rough. "It's shallow," Alira managed, though the pain was sharper than she wanted to admit. "I'll live." Cale's jaw tightened, something raw and furious burning behind his pale eyes. "He tried to kill you because we came too close to the truth. I should have insisted on more protection, I should have." "You could not have known," Alira interrupted gently, reaching up to steady his hand where it hovered near her injured shoulder. "None of us could have known he would move against me so quickly. This only proves how close we truly are, Cale. He is afraid, and frightened men make desperate mistakes." Cale helped her to her feet slowly, his arm wrapping carefully around her waist for support, and something in the careful, protective way he held her sent a warmth through Alira's chest that had nothing to do with the pain in her shoulder. "I nearly lost you tonight," he said quietly, as they made their way toward the healer's chambers. "I do not know what I would have done if that blade had struck true." "You would have found a way to continue anyway," Alira said. "You are the Alpha King. Continuing forward is what you do." "Perhaps," Cale said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I am beginning to understand that some things matter more to me than the crown ever has, and I find that realization far more frightening than any blade." Alira looked up at him then, studying the raw honesty in his expression, and felt something shift inside her own chest, something she had been carefully refusing to acknowledge since the moment he had gone silent on the frozen border. She had come here believing she had nothing left to lose. She was no longer certain that remained true. The healer, a soft-spoken older woman named Clara, cleaned and bandaged the wound with practiced efficiency, assuring them both that the cut, while painful, would heal cleanly without lasting damage. Cale remained by Alira's side throughout the entire process, his presence steady and warm, refusing to leave even when Clara gently suggested he might allow Alira some privacy to rest. "I would prefer he stayed," Alira admitted quietly, surprising herself with how easily the words came. Cale's expression softened at that, something tender flickering behind his usual guarded composure, and he settled into the chair beside her bed without another word, staying long after Clara had extinguished the lamps and retired for the night. They talked quietly in the darkness, about small things at first, childhood memories neither had shared with anyone in years, and then about heavier things, the weight of leadership Cale had carried since his mother's death, the grief Alira still carried for a father she had never properly buried. Somewhere in the quiet hours before dawn, their hands found each other beneath the blankets, fingers intertwining in a gesture neither of them commented on, though both understood exactly what it meant. "The Council will not be able to ignore this attack," Cale said eventually, his thumb tracing gentle circles against her palm. "An assassination attempt within my own fortress, ordered by a man they have trusted for years. This changes everything." "Good," Alira said softly. "Let it change everything. My father deserved better than silence. So does everyone who has died in this war, because one man valued his profits over their lives." Kale lifted her hand gently, pressing a soft kiss against her knuckles, his pale eyes meeting hers with an intensity that stole the breath from her lungs. "Whatever happens next," he said quietly, "know that I do not intend to let you walk through it alone. Not this time. Not ever again, if I have any say in the matter." Alira felt tears prick unexpectedly at the corners of her eyes, though they were not tears of grief this time, but something warmer and far more complicated, an emotion she had not allowed herself to feel since long before her village burned. "Together, then," she whispered. "Together," Kale agreed, and in the quiet darkness of the healer's chambers, surrounded by the lingering scent of herbs and the distant sound of the wind, still howling against the fortress walls, something unspoken, but undeniable, settled firmly into place between them, a bond neither prophecy nor politics had created, but which both of them now recognized as entirely their own. News of the attack spread through the fortress by morning, carried on whispers that grew louder and more urgent with every retelling. By the time Kale called an emergency session of the council, the entire chamber buzzed with a tension that had not existed during their previous meeting, the earlier skepticism replaced now by something closer to alarm. Alira stood beside Kale as he laid the evidence before the assembled council, her injured shoulder still bandaged beneath her sleeve, her voice steady despite the exhaustion pulling at her limbs. She watched the faces around the table shift from doubt to disbelief to open anger as Kale methodically presented the falsified shipment manifests, Simon's testimony, and finally the confession extracted from the man who had attacked her, a confession that named Victor Ashby, directly and without ambiguity. Lord Varric, who had been among the most skeptical of Alira during their first meeting, sat in stunned silence as the evidence mounted, his weathered face growing paler with every new revelation. "This cannot be," he murmured finally, though the words carried little conviction. "Victor has served this council for years, his contributions to our garrisons." "His contributions," Kale interrupted, his voice cold and controlled, "have been stolen directly from the mouths of starving border villages, then resold at inflated prices to fund weapons, used to prolong this war indefinitely. And when a peace negotiation threatened his profits 11 years ago, he arranged for the murder of the man attempting to broker it." The chamber erupted into noise at that, council members speaking over one another in shock and outrage, and it took several long minutes before Kale managed to restore order with a single sharp gesture. Lady Mirren, who had questioned the prophecy so pointedly during their earlier meeting, now studied Alira with an entirely different expression, something closer to genuine remorse. "You accused her of seeking a crown," Lady Mirren said quietly to the room at large, when in truth, she sought only justice for a murder this council failed to investigate properly for over a decade. "Where is Ashby now?" Lord Varric demanded, some of his composure returning as anger replaced shock. "Fled," Edric answered grimly, stepping forward from where he had been standing near the chamber doors. The moment word reached him that his assassin had been captured and had spoken, he abandoned his estate within the hour. "My scouts believe he is making for the southern border, likely intending to seek refuge among the very garrisons he has spent years supplying." Kale's expression darkened further at that news. "Then we ride within the day. I will not allow him the chance to escape justice, nor will I allow him time to destroy whatever remaining evidence might exist within his estate." "Your Majesty," Edric said carefully, "with respect, the southern border sits perilously close to territory, still contested by the border villages. Riding in force so close to that line risks reigniting the very conflict we are trying to end." "Then we ride carefully," Kale said, "but we ride. I will not allow this man another day of freedom after everything he has taken from innocent people on both sides of this war." Alira stepped forward then, her voice firm despite the ache still lingering in her shoulder. "I wish to accompany you." Several council members began to protest immediately, but Kale raised a hand, silencing the objections before they could fully form. "She has more right than anyone in this chamber to see this man brought to justice," he said. "She rides with us." The journey south took the better part of 2 days, the small company moving quickly across frozen terrain that grew increasingly familiar to Alira, the closer they drew to the border villages she had once called home. She rode alongside Kale for much of the journey, their conversation quiet but constant, the earlier tension between them settling into something steadier, something that felt less like the fragile beginnings of trust, and more like its firmly rooted foundation. They found Victor Ashby's southern estate abandoned, but for a handful of frightened servants, who quickly confirmed that their master had fled further south only hours before their arrival, taking with him a small group of loyal guards and whatever coin and documents he had managed to gather in haste. Kale's scouts tracked the fleeing party toward an old garrison near the very frozen border, where Alira had first walked barefoot carrying her father's flag. "He is running toward the one place he believes we cannot follow without risking war," Kale said grimly, studying the tracks left behind in the snow. "He believes the border villages will shelter him, rather than allow an army from my kingdom to cross uninvited." "Then we do not cross as an army," Alira said. "We cross as we did before, carefully, quietly, with truth as our only weapon." Kale studied her for a long moment, something like admiration flickering behind his pale eyes. "You continue to surprise me, Alira Voss." "Good," she said, a faint smile touching her lips, despite the gravity of their situation. "I would hate to become predictable." They approached the border garrison the following morning, a small company rather than a full army, Kale and Alira riding at the front alongside Edric and a handful of trusted soldiers. The garrison commander, an older man named Arthur who had once served alongside Alira's father, recognized her immediately upon their arrival, his weathered face shifting through shock, grief, and finally cautious hope. "Alira Voss," he said, stepping forward as they dismounted. "I feared you had died alongside the rest of your village." "I nearly did," Alira admitted. "But I am here now, seeking the man responsible for my father's death, and for the deaths of countless others on both sides of this war." Arthur's expression hardened at that, and he gestured toward the garrison's main hall without further explanation. "He arrived last night, claiming sanctuary from bandits pursuing him through the wilderness. Something about his manner troubled me from the start, though I could not say precisely why until this moment." They found Victor Ashby inside the hall, seated near a modest fire, his fine clothing now rumpled and stained from days of hard travel. He rose the moment he saw them enter, his practiced charm faltering visibly as his eyes landed on Kale's grim expression and the small company of soldiers accompanying him. "Your Majesty," Victor said, attempting a smile that did not reach his eyes. "I confess I did not expect to see you so far from the fortress." "Save your pleasantries," Kale said coldly. "We have your confession, Ashby. We have the shipment manifests, the falsified records, and the testimony of the man you hired to silence Alira Voss before she could expose your crimes. There is nowhere left for you to run." Victor's composure cracked fully then, something desperate and ugly replacing his earlier charm. "You do not understand what you are destroying," he said, his voice rising. "This war has kept order along these borders for years. Peace is fragile, unpredictable. My arrangements ensured stability, ensured that whoever won or lost, the flow of goods and coin continued without interruption." "Your arrangements," Alira said, stepping forward, her voice trembling with barely controlled fury, "murdered my father. They have starved villages, prolonged suffering, and cost countless innocent lives, all so that you could grow wealthy from other people's grief." Victor's eyes flicked toward her, something calculating still flickering behind his desperation. "You cannot prove I ordered his death directly." "We do not need to," Kale said. "The manifest concerning his travel, the bribe you offered to have it misplaced, the pattern of sabotage that followed every failed peace attempt for over a decade. The council has already seen enough to convict you a dozen times over, Ashby. Running here has only confirmed your guilt beyond any remaining doubt." Victor's shoulders sagged, the fight visibly draining out of him, as he realized, finally, that there was truly nowhere left to escape. The garrison soldiers moved forward at Arthur's signal, taking Victor into custody without resistance, his earlier bravado replaced now by the hollow silence of a man who understood his reckoning had finally arrived. As they led him away, Alira felt no triumph, only a quiet, aching relief. The truth of her father's death finally exposed, after 11 long years of unanswered grief. She turned to find Kale watching her, his expression carrying both understanding and something warmer still. And together, they stood in the quiet garrison hall, the weight of years finally beginning to lift from both their shoulders. Their relief did not last through the night. Arthur offered them shelter within the garrison, while preparations were made to transport Victor Ashby back to the fortress for formal trial before the council. Alira slept fitfully, her body finally allowing exhaustion to catch up with her after days of relentless travel and tension, though her rest was broken well before dawn by the sound of shouting echoing through the garrison halls. She woke to find Cale already dressed, his expression grim as he strapped on his sword with quick, practiced movements. "Ashby's men," he said, before she could ask. "The guards he brought with him from his estate. They attempted to free him during the night watch." Elira dressed quickly, following Cale out into the garrison courtyard, where chaos had erupted between Arthur's soldiers and a small group of armed men attempting to force their way toward the cell where Victor was being held. The fighting was brief but fierce, and Elira watched with her heart in her throat as Cale moved through the confusion with the same fierce competence she had witnessed the night of her own attack, disarming and subduing Victor's men one by one until the remaining few threw down their weapons in surrender. It was only afterward, once the courtyard had settled and the prisoners were secured, that they discovered the true purpose behind the attempted rescue. One of Victor's captured guards, shaking with fear and exhaustion, finally admitted under Edric's questioning that their orders had never truly been to free their employer at all. "He told us," the guard stammered, "that if capture seemed certain, we were to ensure he did not survive to stand trial. Better a quick end than a public confession that might expose others involved in his schemes." Elira's blood ran cold at the implication. "Others," she repeated. "He was not acting alone." The guard nodded miserably. "I do not know names. He was careful never to speak specifics in front of us. But he mentioned, more than once, that certain members of the council itself had profited alongside him over the years. He believed, if his crimes were exposed, he would not be the only one to fall." Cale's expression turned to stone at that revelation, and Elira understood immediately the weight of what it meant. The corruption they had uncovered was not isolated to a single greedy merchant. It ran deeper, into the very council meant to advise and protect the kingdom, and rooting it out entirely would require far more than a single arrest. "We return to the fortress immediately," Cale said. "Ashby remains alive, under heavy guard, until his trial. Whatever names he carries, we will have them, one way or another." The return journey felt heavier than their initial pursuit had been, the weight of new suspicion settling over the small company as they rode north once more. Elira found herself studying every soldier, every face among their escort, wondering who among them might harbor loyalty to whatever hidden conspiracy Victor's guard had hinted at. The trust she had slowly begun building within these unfamiliar walls now felt fragile again, threatened by an enemy whose face she could not yet identify. "You have gone quiet," Cale observed, riding close beside her as the fortress finally came into view on the horizon. "I am trying to imagine who among your council might have accepted Ashby's coin," Elira admitted. "Lord Varric seemed genuinely shocked during our meeting, Lady Mirren as well. But shock can be performed just as easily as loyalty, and I no longer know how to tell the difference." "Nor do I," Cale admitted, his jaw tight, "which is precisely why we must be patient and precise in how we proceed. An accusation without proof will only drive whoever else is involved further into hiding, and give them time to cover their tracks completely. Then how do we find proof?" "We let Ashby believe his silence still protects him," Cale said, "and we watch closely for any sign of who among us grows nervous in the days following his capture." Their return to the fortress was met with a mixture of relief and renewed anxiety among the staff and council alike. Victor Ashby was placed in the deepest cell beneath the fortress, guarded by soldiers personally selected by Edric, men whose loyalty to Cale had been tested and proven over many years of service. The council convened once more, and this time, no one questioned Elira's presence at Cale's side as he laid out the full account of what had transpired at the southern garrison. It was during this second council meeting that Elira first noticed the subtle shift in Lord Varric's demeanor, a tension in his shoulders that had not been present during their earlier discussions, a carefulness in his words that suggested a man choosing each syllable with unusual deliberation. She said nothing at the time, but she filed the observation away carefully, remembering Cale's advice to watch closely for signs of nervousness among those closest to the unfolding scandal. Later that evening, walking alone through the fortress gardens to clear her thoughts, Elira encountered Nora once more, the older woman's sharp eyes carrying a knowing weight that suggested she too had noticed something amiss. "You suspect someone," Nora said, without preamble. "Lord Varric," Elira admitted. "Something about his manner during today's meeting felt wrong. Too careful, too controlled." Nora nodded slowly, her expression thoughtful. Varric has served this council since before Cale's mother died. He was among her most trusted advisors, at least outwardly. But I have long suspected his loyalty runs shallower than his reputation suggests. Wealth changes people, Elira, even those who once believed themselves incorruptible. Do you have proof? Not yet, Nora admitted, but I have my own ways of learning what men prefer to keep hidden. Give me time, and I believe I can uncover whatever connection exists between Varric and the schemes we have already exposed. Elira nodded, grateful for the older woman's quiet competence, though the weight of ongoing uncertainty pressed heavily against her chest. She had believed, foolishly perhaps, that exposing Victor Ashby would bring some measure of closure to the grief she had carried for over a decade. Instead, it had only opened a deeper, more troubling question about how far the rot within this kingdom truly extended. She found Cale later that night in his private study, the same room where they had first uncovered Ashby's falsified manifests weeks earlier. He looked up as she entered, his expression softening in the particular way it always did when their eyes met, a warmth that had grown steadily more open in the days since the attack in the corridor. Nora suspects Varric, she said, settling into the chair across from his desk. As do I, Cale admitted, though suspicion alone changes nothing. We must be patient a while longer, Elira, however difficult that patience may prove to be. I am growing tired of patience, Elira admitted, some of the day's frustration finally slipping through her carefully maintained composure. I want this finished. I want my father's memory to finally rest, rather than continuing to be dragged through one revelation after another. Cale rose from his desk and came to kneel before her chair, taking her hands gently in his own. It will finish, he said softly. I promise you that, Elira. Whatever remains hidden within this council, we will expose it fully, and your father's memory will finally receive the justice it has been denied for far too long. But we must be careful, because the moment we move too quickly, we risk losing everything we have built toward that justice. Elira studied his face, the sincerity in his pale eyes, and felt some of her frustration soften into something closer to trust. You have become remarkably good at calming my temper, she observed, a faint smile touching her lips despite herself. I have had considerable practice these past weeks, Cale replied, his own smile warm and unguarded, in a way that made her chest ache pleasantly. Though I confess, I find myself hoping the practice continues for a very long time yet. Elira felt her breath catch at the quiet implication behind his words, and for a long, suspended moment, neither of them spoke, the weight of everything unspoken between them, settling comfortably into the warm silence of the study. Outside, the winter wind continued its familiar howl against the fortress walls, but within that small, quiet room, for the first time since she had walked barefoot across the frozen border, Elira felt something close to peace. Nora's investigation into Lord Varric took nearly a week to bear fruit, a week during which Elira found herself growing increasingly restless, despite Cale's steady reassurances. She spent much of that time assisting Simon in the archive halls, cross-referencing older shipment records against council attendance logs, searching for any pattern that might connect Varric's presence at court to moments of significant sabotage throughout the war's long history. It was tedious work, made bearable only by the growing closeness that had settled between herself and Cale during the quiet evenings they spent together afterward. He would often join her in the archive hall once his other duties concluded, sitting across the table reviewing his own reports while she worked through dusty ledgers. And though they spoke little during these shared hours, the comfortable silence between them felt more meaningful than words might have allowed. It was during one such evening that Nora finally arrived with the proof they had been searching for, her expression carrying a grim satisfaction that told Elira immediately the wait had not been in vain. Varric's youngest son, Nora said, settling into the chair beside them and producing a small collection of letters from beneath her cloak. He has been living quietly in a coastal town for several years, funded by payments that Varric has carefully disguised as inheritance from a distant relative. In truth, the boy owes considerable gambling debts to men connected directly to Victor Ashby's smuggling operations. Varric has been quietly using his position on the council to protect those operations, in exchange for his son's debts being forgiven. Cale read through the letters carefully, his expression darkening with every line. This is enough, he said finally. Combined with Ashby's testimony, should he choose to speak freely, this will be more than sufficient to expose Varric's involvement before the full council. Will Ashby speak freely? Alira asked. He has shown little inclination toward cooperation since his capture. He will, Kale said grimly. Once he understands that his silence protects no one but the men who abandoned him the moment his capture became certain. Men are rarely loyal to conspiracies once those conspiracies stop benefiting them directly. Kale proved correct. When confronted the following morning with evidence of Varric's involvement, Victor Ashby's carefully maintained silence finally broke entirely, and he spoke at length, naming not only Varric but 2 additional council members who had, over the years, quietly accepted bribes in exchange for supporting policies that prolonged the war rather than resolving it. He spoke, too, of the assassination attempt against Alira, confirming that the order had come directly from him, though he insisted, with what remained of his pride, that Varric had known nothing specific about that particular scheme. The revelations that followed shook the fortress to its foundation. Lord Varric was arrested within hours, his protests of innocence growing increasingly desperate as additional evidence mounted against him. The 2 remaining council members named by Ashby were confronted separately, and while one maintained his innocence under intense questioning, the other confessed quickly, apparently relieved to finally unburden himself of guilt he had carried silently for years. Lady Mirren, who had proven herself unexpectedly sympathetic toward Alira during the ordeal, took on the difficult task of helping restructure the council in the aftermath, ensuring that trusted, uncorrupted voices filled the vacancies left behind by the scandal. Alira found herself, somewhat to her own surprise, consulted frequently during this process, her insight into the suffering of the border villages proving invaluable as the council began drafting the framework for a lasting peace between the 2 nations. It was during one of these long planning sessions, held late into the evening within Kale's private study, that Edric finally broached a subject he had clearly been considering for some time. "Your Majesty," he said carefully, glancing between Kale and Alira with an expression that had softened considerably since their earlier conflict. "The border villages will need more than a treaty to trust this peace fully. They will need to see, clearly and undeniably, that this alliance carries real weight behind it." "What are you suggesting?" Kale asked. "A formal union," Edric said, "between yourself and Lady Voss. The prophecy already carries weight among both our people and hers. Formalizing that bond, publicly and deliberately, would send a message no treaty alone could achieve." Alira felt her breath catch, glancing toward Kale, uncertain how he would respond to a suggestion that reduced something she had come to feel so deeply personal into a matter of political strategy. To her relief, Kale's expression carried none of the calculation she feared, only a quiet, hopeful warmth as his eyes met hers across the study. "That decision," he said slowly, "belongs to Alira alone. I will not have her feel pressured into a union she does not desire, regardless of what political advantage it might offer this kingdom." Alira felt something warm bloom in her chest at his words, gratitude mixing with an emotion she had been carefully avoiding naming for weeks now. She thought of her father, of the flag she had carried across the frozen border, of the peace he had died trying to achieve. She thought, too, of the quiet evenings spent beside Kale in the archive hall, the steady warmth of his presence that had become, somehow, without her fully realizing it, one of the few constants she trusted completely in an uncertain world. "I do not need the prophecy to make this choice," she said finally, her voice steady, despite the weight of the moment. "I make it because I have come to know the man behind the crown, and I find that I do not wish to imagine my future without him standing beside me." Kale crossed the room in 3 quick strides, taking her hands in his own, with an urgency that betrayed how deeply her words had affected him. "Then let it be known," he said softly, "that whatever this union means for the peace between our peoples, it began, first and always, as a choice made freely by 2 people who found something worth choosing in each other." Edric, watching the exchange with visible relief, allowed himself a small, satisfied smile before quietly excusing himself from the room, leaving Kale and Alira alone in the warm firelight of the study, the weight of the past weeks finally beginning to settle into something resembling hope for the future they intended to build together. News of the union spread quickly through both kingdoms, carried by messengers dispatched to every border village and garrison within the week. Kale insisted that the formal announcement take place not within the fortress, but at the very border, where Alira had first walked barefoot across the ice, believing the location itself carried symbolic weight that no grand hall within his own kingdom could replicate. Preparations began almost immediately, and Alira found herself swept into a whirlwind of activity, unlike anything she had experienced during her quiet years on the border. Seamstresses arrived to fashion garments suited for the occasion. Envoys were dispatched to invite representatives from every border village that remained, and Nora, ever practical, oversaw the arrangements with the same sharp efficiency she had once used to investigate the fortress's hidden corruption. Not everyone within the kingdom welcomed the news with open acceptance. Whispers persisted among certain factions still loyal to the old ways, men and women who had grown comfortable with the war's familiar rhythms and viewed peace as an unpredictable, even dangerous disruption to the order they understood. Kale took these whispers seriously, increasing security around the fortress and the planned ceremony alike, unwilling to allow complacency after everything Ashby's schemes had already cost them. His caution proved warranted. 3 nights before the ceremony was set to take place, a rider arrived at the fortress gates, bearing urgent news from Arthur at the southern garrison. A small but well-armed group, composed largely of soldiers still loyal to the imprisoned Lord Varric, had gathered near the border, apparently intending to disrupt the ceremony entirely, believing that preventing the union might somehow preserve the fragile power structure that Varric's arrest had shattered. "They cannot possibly believe this will succeed," Alira said, reading the report with a growing sense of unease. "Varric has already confessed his crimes. What do they hope to accomplish?" "Desperation rarely requires logic," Kale said grimly. "They understand that this ceremony represents the final, undeniable proof that the old corruption has been defeated. If they can disrupt it, perhaps violently, they believe they can sow enough chaos to delay the peace indefinitely, buying time to regroup or flee before facing full justice for their involvement." "Then we prepare accordingly," Alira said, her voice steady despite the fear coiling in her stomach. "I did not survive an assassin's blade and a frozen border crossing, only to be stopped now, days before finally seeing this peace made real." Kale increased the guard around their travel party significantly, and Edric personally selected the soldiers who would accompany them to the border, men whose loyalty had been tested repeatedly throughout the recent turmoil. Arthur, too, prepared his garrison forces to intercept the gathering threat before it could reach the ceremony site, though Kale remained wary that their preparations might not prove sufficient against a group willing to risk everything out of pure desperation. They arrived at the border 2 days before the ceremony, and Alira found herself standing once more upon the same frozen ground where her journey with Kale had first begun. The landscape looked different now, somehow, despite being unchanged in every physical sense. Where she had once seen only danger and desperation, she now saw the beginnings of something hopeful, tents already being raised for the gathering crowds, banners bearing both kingdoms' colors fluttering side by side rather than opposed. The threatened attack came on the ceremony's very eve, under cover of darkness, when Varric's remaining loyalists attempted to breach the perimeter of the ceremonial grounds. Alira woke to shouting and the clash of steel, her heart pounding as she rushed from her tent to find chaos erupting across the camp, soldiers scrambling to repel the sudden assault. Kale was already in the thick of the fighting, his sword flashing in the torchlight as he fought alongside Edric and Arthur's soldiers to push back the attackers. Alira grabbed a blade from a fallen guard near her tent, refusing to simply hide, while the peace she had fought so hard to achieve hung in the balance. She fought carefully, defending rather than seeking confrontation, until she found herself face to face with one of the attackers, a young soldier whose desperate, frightened eyes suggested he understood, even as he raised his blade against her, that this fight had already been lost. She disarmed him with a maneuver her father had taught her years ago, pinning him against the frozen ground rather than delivering a killing blow. "This ends tonight," she said, her voice carrying clearly over the chaos. "Whatever loyalty you owe Varric, know that he sold his loyalty to corruption long before tonight. Surrender now, and you may yet see mercy." The young soldier, trembling, finally dropped what remained of his resolve, calling out to his fellow attackers to yield rather than continue a fight they could not win. One by one, the remaining loyalists surrendered as the sky began to lighten toward dawn, Kale's forces securing the perimeter fully as the last resistance crumbled. Kale found Alira standing amid the settling chaos, her blade still in hand, her expression fierce, despite the exhaustion evident in her posture. He crossed the distance between them quickly, relief flooding his features as he confirmed she remained unharmed. "You should have stayed hidden," he said, though there was no real reproach in his voice, only fear finally allowed to surface now that the danger had passed. "I have spent enough of my life hiding," Elira replied, lowering her blade. "This piece belongs to me, as much as it belongs to you, Kale. I will not simply wait in a tent while others fight to protect it." Kale studied her for a long moment, something fierce and proud settling into his expression, before he pulled her into a firm embrace, careless of the blood and dirt still marking them both from the night's chaos. "Then we protect it together," he said quietly, "as we always have, and as I intend we always will." Around them, the camp slowly settled back into order, soldiers tending to the wounded and securing the captured attackers, while overhead, the first pale light of dawn began spreading across the frozen valley, illuminating the very ground where, weeks earlier, a barefoot woman, carrying a broken flag, had first changed the course of a war neither she nor the Alpha King had ever truly wanted. By the time the sun rose fully over the frozen valley, word of the failed attack had already spread through the gathering crowds, and rather than sowing the fear its perpetrators had intended, it seemed instead to strengthen the resolve of everyone present. Border villagers and soldiers of the Alpha King's kingdom alike moved through the camp together in the aftermath, tending wounds and clearing debris side by side, a small but powerful glimpse of the unity the ceremony had always intended to represent. Elira spent the morning resting at Kale's insistence, though sleep proved elusive, her mind still turning over everything that had led her to this frozen border twice now, once in desperation and grief, and now in hope, and something she was finally ready to call love. Nora arrived shortly before midday to help her prepare, her sharp eyes softening with something like pride as she worked. "Your father would be proud of you," Nora said quietly, fastening the final clasp on the deep blue gown chosen for the ceremony, its fabric embroidered with silver thread that caught the pale winter light like frost. "Not simply for surviving what you have endured, but for the peace you have helped build from the ashes of his death." "I could not have done it without you," Elira said, meaning the words completely. "Without your courage in coming forward, without your patience in helping uncover the truth. I owe you more than I could ever properly repay." "You owe me nothing," Nora said firmly, though her eyes shone with emotion she rarely allowed herself to show. "Simply live well, Elira. Build the peace your father died believing was possible. That is repayment enough for an old woman who has waited a very long time to see this kingdom finally healed." When Elira emerged from her tent, she found the ceremonial grounds transformed since the previous night's chaos. Banners bearing both kingdoms' colors raised high along the frozen border, crowds gathering from both sides in numbers larger than she had dared hope, drawn by whispers of a peace that finally seemed real, rather than merely promised. Arthur stood near the front of the border village representatives, his weathered face carrying quiet satisfaction as he watched her approach. Kale waited at the center of the gathering, dressed not in the dark armor she had first seen him wearing on this very ground, but in formal robes that somehow made him look both more regal and more approachable at once. His pale eyes found hers the moment she stepped into view, and the same silence that had struck him during their first meeting seemed to settle over him again now, though this time it carried none of the shock or confusion from before, only quiet, overwhelming wonder. She walked toward him across the frozen ground, and this time she wore proper boots rather than walking barefoot through the snow, though the symbolism of the moment felt no less powerful for that small difference. In her hands, she carried the flag her father had died defending, its torn fabric finally mended, the two halves stitched carefully back together by Nora's steady hands, the old bloodstains left visible as a reminder, rather than something to be hidden or erased. When she reached Kale, she lifted the mended flag between them, and he took hold of the opposite edge, the two of them raising it together, as the crowds on both sides of the border fell silent, watching the symbol of their shattered alliance rise once more, whole and unbroken, above the frozen valley that had witnessed so much grief. "This flag," Kale said, his voice carrying clearly across the gathered crowd, "was torn apart by greed and betrayal, and it very nearly cost us everything worth protecting. It was carried across this very border, by a woman brave enough to risk everything for peace, when peace seemed impossible to everyone else. Today, we raise it not as a symbol of what was lost, but as a promise of what we intend to build together, from this day forward." He turned to Elira then, taking her hands in his own before the assembled crowd. Elira Voss, he said, his voice softening, though it still carried to every corner of the silent gathering. You walked into my life, carrying grief and desperation. And you leave it now, carrying hope for every person on both sides of this border. I do not offer you a crown out of prophecy or obligation. I offer it because I have come to love you, freely and completely, and because I cannot imagine building this peace, or any future, without you standing beside me. Cale Draven, Elira replied, her voice steady despite the emotion swelling in her chest. You were once the silence I feared most, the king whose name alone brought terror to my people. I have come to know instead a man of quiet grief and genuine hope, willing to risk his own throne for a peace he believed in, more than his own safety. I accept this not because prophecy demands it, but because I choose it, freely, with my whole heart. The crowd erupted into cheers that echoed across the frozen valley, border villagers and soldiers alike celebrating together for the first time in over a decade of bitter conflict. Cale pulled Elira close, and as their lips met before the assembled crowds, the mended flag fluttered above them in the winter wind, whole and unbroken, a symbol finally restored to what it had always been meant to represent. In the months that followed, the peace they had built together proved sturdier than either of them had dared hope. The border villages slowly rebuilt, aided by resources finally directed honestly, rather than siphoned away by greed. Lord Varric and Victor Ashby faced full justice before a restructured, trustworthy council, their punishment serving as a clear warning against future corruption. Arthur was appointed to oversee the border garrisons under joint authority, ensuring both kingdoms' interests were represented fairly in the peace that followed. Elira never forgot the frozen ground where her journey had begun, and she returned often throughout the following years, sometimes alone, sometimes with Cale at her side, always carrying with her the quiet gratitude of a woman who had walked into that field expecting death, and found instead the beginning of everything she had never dared to hope for. The broken flag that had once symbolized a shattered alliance now hung, fully restored, within the great hall of the fortress, a permanent reminder to all who saw it that even the deepest wounds between people could be mended, given enough courage, enough truth, and enough willingness to choose peace over the comfortable familiarity of war. And so it was that the Alpha King, once known throughout both kingdoms for his silence and his fearsome reputation, became known instead as the king who had found his voice again, beside a barefoot woman on a frozen border, and together, they built a peace that would be remembered for generations to come.